It's July the 17th, 2012. We're in Stellenbosch, South Africa, about 50 k's out of Cape Town, South Africa. And I'm here to talk to Professor Willie Estreisen about his book Endgame, Secrets and Talks and the End of Apartheid. Professor Estreisen, Willie, if I may call you so, I have to acknowledge that we know each other for a very long time as personal friends, and also somebody that I used a lot during my television days on programs here in South Africa. Willie, I want to take you back to 1989, when I was here back from the Institute, now School for Conflict Analysis and Resolution at George Mason University. I was on a personal family trip, but I visited you at your home. And you asked me if I'm coming back to South Africa. And I said, Willie, how would I know that? It's going to take 3 or 4 years. And you said, Jannie, apartheid's over. Don't ask me why. I can't tell you. But how did you know?
Jannie, first of all, it's really a privilege to talk to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I was very confident, and of course I was right. And the reason was quite simple. I got involved in as a go-between between the National Intelligence Agency and the ANC in exile since 1987. So I sort of experienced the progress that was being made with these talks. And the objective of the talks was to get a negotiated deal. I think that was the objective. The only question was in what way and who should be the main player. So yes, Jannie, I was very, very confident, and I've always hoped that you would come back.
And Mandela was released in 1990, and you had to keep secrets during that time.
Of course, yeah. I think one of the very important things that I have come to sort of not just know, but which was extremely important, is that these sort of talks are extremely delicate, and you can't deal with these sort of talks in the newspapers, etc., because there's a lot of vested interest and other things that needs to be taken into account. So I couldn't even tell you, one of my very good friends, the background of my confidence and the reasons for my confidence.
So Willie, we're talking about 87 to 89. We're in 2012. Why this book? Why only now?
There are two reasons. The one was it's extremely important to sort of wait and to just reflect about the days that I got involved. And there was a second, I think, and I'll say a more important reason. The person I interacted with, the most important one in those days, was Thabo Mbeki. And of course he was one of the front runners in the liberated ANC. And he became deputy president. And it was not a considered decision, but it was an understanding between the two of us that we shouldn't go public and that we shouldn't write about all sorts of experiences we had during the 80s, because the 90s was the years of consolidation and of building a new democracy, and we sort of agreed informally that we must wait. That's the reason why we didn't give all sorts of, make all sorts of declarations, or even didn't agree to give interviews with people all around the world. And for me personally, the main reason was that I had to sort out that period, because it was a very complicated period. It was not just talks about talks with the ANC. There were a number of other incidences and occurrences, etc. And it was not easy to write the story about the talks if you don't get a grip on the context in which these talks took place. So that was the third reason for me personally why I waited so long.
So set the scene for us about the complexity of South Africa during that period. I mean, 1985 was a very rough time in South Africa, a lot of violence. So what was the background sort of from 80s onwards? Set the scene for us on what South Africa was during that time.
I mean, I can describe it in 2 words: blood in the streets and corpses all around. Young people being shot at, and
By the security
by
police.
the security police,
Yeah.
and we came very close to what I would like to term endemic violence, and we were, of course, a deeply divided society. And I think and I did some work for the Urban Foundation, and the Urban Foundation was a private sector sponsored organization with the objective to improve the living conditions of black people in townships. And for the whole of 85, I got involved. So I had eyeball to eyeball confrontation with what happened in Soweto. And of course, 1985, it was also the infamous Rubicon speech by P.W. Botha, and a lot of hope with even among black people were destroyed by that particular speech, and also among white people.
Remind us just what that was.
The Rubicon speech was the speech that was broadcast right across the globe, and there was the hope that in that speech he will declare and make known more specific reform objectives and also procedures.
But he didn't cross the
But he
Rubicon.
didn't. In fact, he got angry for whatever reason, and then just blew it. He just blew it.
Now, there was a lot of violence between the security forces and black people in South Africa.
Yeah.
But there was also black on black violence.
I would like to mention that and emphasize it, because it's a very delicate sort of thing for me as a white person to mention. But I mentioned it in my book, because when I started to write up the story and see if there is a plot, or is there some sort of interconnectedness, the one thing which I really sort of shocked me afterwards is the intensity of the black on black violence,
Which occurred because...
which occurred, of course, also of a power struggle within black circles, among specific ethnic groups and among certain political groups, and it was rough, very rough. Now, I think I have to say this also, one must also accept that this black on black violence was also instigated by forces within the security establishment, because they could then justify the state of emergency in that sort of manner.
which was the 85, right?
Yeah, just remember, we had a state of emergency.
Yes.
It was the first state of emergency in 1990 since Sharpeville.
I remember those terrible tire murders of people who were seen as traitors
Yeah.
to any group.
What is not known, maybe into broad circles, is that the ANC, towards the end of the 70s, after 1976, with the uprising among the youth within Soweto and other places, the ANC leadership, with Thabo Mbeki included, went to Vietnam and met with General Giap,
Interesting.
who was the military strategist, in my opinion,
Yeah.
in those days.
Never heard of this.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And they had a long talk with Giap about how to organize and manage what was then called a people's war. And then the people's war emerged within South Africa, very, very much orchestrated, not just by the youth, but also by the United Democratic Front, which was an organization inside South Africa. The ANC was banned. Then, of course, P.W. Botha also banned the UDF, but then the UDF transformed itself in what they called themselves a mass democratic movement with no constitution, nothing,
Yeah,
just leaders.
yeah, yeah.
So it was really a people's war.
United Democratic Front, just remind us again what their aims were.
The United Democratic Front and people like Bishop Tutu and Alan Busak and a number of others also, and even Muslim leaders, joined that movement, and the objective was the end of apartheid and to liberate South Africa from the oppression of apartheid, and it became quite a strong and effective movement. And I think the important thing about the United Democratic Front was that it also motivated the youth, the young people, to participate, which put a lot of, in those days, a lot of pressure on the system as such.
And we're talking about black people.
And I'm talking about black people, and then as we call them in those days, coloreds and also Asians.
Yeah, but we're not talking about white folks who were energized by that, really, on the whole.
A number of white people also participated in the UDF.
Now, there was also a lot of turmoil in white South Africa. You were a philosophy professor at the time, and now emeritus. And white South Africans, especially among the intelligentsia, were very divided. And in Afrikaans we call them die verligtes and the verkramptes. The enlightened ones and the ultra-conservative ones. You were seen as a verligte. Set the scene for me just about that divide and the difficulties around that in terms of the future of South Africa.
I think, Anja, I must also mention that the Afrikaners changed. Because the Afrikaners had a rural history, became involved in the industrialization of South Africa, and built up big businesses, and they became, if I may use the word, modernized.
From taking over the government in 48 up to 85.
Absolutely. And they were under pressure because there were sanctions, particularly financial sanctions. And I'm one of those who say that financial sanctions was one of the reasons why the business community in South Africa, particularly among the Afrikaners, started to ask questions about their future and the future of the institutions that they've been managing. So that was an important element.
Which were endangered by the violence surrounding
apartheid. It was endangered. And I think a second reason is also that South Africa became involved in a war in Angola. And young people and the parents at home were beginning to ask questions about the morality of our involvement in Angola.
There was the incident in southern Angola where a dozen or so white South Africans died, and that really turned the tide.
And then, of course, with the settlement in Namibia, it opened the door to settlement in South Africa. But to talk about more specifically about the Afrikaners, I think P.W. Botha's Rubicon speech, which destroyed a lot of hope, created not so much despair among Afrikaners, but something else. We need to do something about this, and that's why there was a breakaway, the independent movement, not big but small, with a couple of Afrikaner leaders, and I think most importantly, in 1986, 1987, it was also clear that intellectuals, Afrikaner intellectuals with credibility, didn't want to identify or even associate with the National Party. And it sort of undermined that the legitimacy the National Party had within Afrikaners. So there's a number of reasons, and all these work together in the 80s to bring us to the table.
I want to move up to your secret negotiations, but one of the things that I always thought particularly interesting, particularly sad, is that among the verligtes there were people who wrote books, who took a stand, who were crushed by the system and by the National Party in terms of their careers and lives. I call them, an Afrikaans word, the verguisde Afrikaners. the crushed Afrikaners. To a degree, no one's ever apologized what has been done to them, and I'm saying that only to reiterate and ask you to talk a little bit about the price that many Afrikaners paid, which the world does not really understand, for their stand against apartheid.
Oh, I agree with you. Absolutely. And they were not just alienated, they were pushed out of cultural and some other organizations. You see, the Afrikaner community was a very well organized community with institutions, hierarchical institutions, the church included, the Dutch Reformed Church and the other within this organizational, let's call it, culture. And with the Afrikaner Broederbond, which was a secret Afrikaner organization, very powerful, with key figures of the Afrikaner community within the leadership. No women allowed, just to mention. I was a member until 1987, when I decided to resign from the Afrikaner Broederbond. But it was a closely knit. So if one used the word social capital, it's one of the words now in the literature. The Afrikaners had a lot of social capital, bonding capital, bridging capital, you name it. Now we can ask questions about the nature of that capital, but you must accept that it was quite strong.
They also had the economic capital.
Yeah, so those not involved in the organizational and structural setup of the Afrikaner were just outsiders, and it was they had a hard time. It was not just a question of being criticized in public. It was also a question of they're not part of the power base of the Afrikaners. So they were outsiders.
Now, the Broederbond, the Brotherhood of Afrikaners, had an interesting history. You were known as a liberal, but many of my academic friends had some, what shall I call it, difficulty with the fact that you were deemed as a liberal in some circles but belonged to the Broederbond. How did you square that difference? Tell us a little about the history of that, because as a secret society that was seen as the inner circle of the defense of conservatism and holding on to apartheid.
Yeah, it's a very difficult but extremely important question you ask, and I'll try and answer it as honestly as possible. Of course, it's not just the Broederbond. There was something else also for the young people.
Ruiterwag.
The Ruiterwag. And I became a member of the Ruiterwag here in Stellenbosch.
As a young academic.
As a young academic. So then one sort of progress through the Ruiterwag and other organizations up till you get to the top of the hierarchy, which was then the Afrikaner Broederbond. And I must say, you know, when I joined, there was already a lot of debate within the Afrikaner Broederbond, and that was one of the reasons why I wrote a book in 1979, which was called Apartheid Must Die. It was also written in Afrikaans, and there was a lot of criticism, but because I was a member of the Broederbond, no one really tried to sort of kick me out. There was a lot of debate. I don't want to parade here as someone who was, you know, one of the strong critical forces within the Broederbond. Let me answer your question.
Okay.
Because I realized, it's a personal sort of position that I've taken, that within South Africa, if you can't stay inside, you're a loner outside. You become an outsider. So it's a compromise. And life in many instances are about compromises. So it was, for me, it was a deliberate compromise to see, and some others also, that if we can stay as long as possible within the structures of Afrikaner in order in that manner to see if we can influence change. And it was only in 1987 that some of us decided enough is enough. But when we left, it also had an impact on the National Party. So yes, it was a compromise. Not always easy, but life, as I've said, is not without compromises.
But Apartheid Must Die must have brought you a lot of dislike within the Broederbond.
Yes, for a month long I had to read letters and stuff like that, which sort of, took me up. And I mean, looking back on that book, I'm prepared to say it was not such an explosive or important book, but I think the phrase "Apartheid must die" and the Afrikaans is even better. Direct translation is "farewell to apartheid."
Yeah.
But it was focused very much on the morality of the system. And I think, Jannie, the important thing that happened among intellectuals and Afrikaner academics is that they started to look at the morality of the system, not the morality of certain laws or whatever, but the system. And I think when that change took place among Afrikaner intellectuals, the writing was on the wall. The writing was on the wall.
Now, what is quite amazing about this history is that all of this change that you became part of in the secret negotiations in London, etc., did not come from within the intelligentsia, within academics.
Yeah.
It came from the National Intelligence Agency, of all things.
Yeah.
I think that kind of surprised and shocked a lot of people.
Yeah.
Tell us how that happened, and tell us a little about the role of that institution in South African society at the time.
I just want to emphasize, that a number of processes took place at the events. I think this one was with the National Intelligence Agency was a very important one, but one should be very careful not to say this was the only one. There were a number of others. Now, my involvement started with 2 phone calls. The one from London, that was the first phone call from someone very close to a company with the name of Consgold, which was a well-known company based in London with holdings in South Africa, goldfields, and there was a reason, because they were worried about their future in South Africa. So there was a meeting, Consgold, between the top brass of Consgold and Oliver Tambo and Thabo Mbeki and a few others, and they discussed the issue of sanctions. So I got a phone call, and I think the company and the main spokesperson was desperate, and they didn't know what to do. So they got the phone call and they said, would you be prepared to talk with some other Afrikaners informally with the ANC in exile?
Okay, but they were worried about, their role, let me not be too critical, but they were also worried about the future of their holdings in South Africa, because if apartheid became a civil war, so would their finances would go down.
No doubt about it. But I take the view, whatever reason helps to facilitate a process of negotiation, it's a good reason.
Okay.
So in that sense, I'm prepared to go for certain what I'll say risky compromises. And so, but I think the second phone call I got a few weeks later was more important. That was from Pretoria, from National Intelligence, and they didn't. They came to see me at my house in Stellenbosch, and they didn't tell me that they have in mind a process that will facilitate negotiations and so on. They were already busy with that process, with the talks with the so-called prison talks, which started in 1985, and then became more formalized in 1988. So there was another process. And so they didn't tell me about that. I only heard about it at the later stage. And but they did ask me whether I would be prepared to interact with the ANC, report to them, and so on. And I also agreed. After some thought, I also agreed. It was another sort of risky compromise, and so the two phone calls changed my life.
Other people got that phone call too and said no thank you.
Probably.
You mentioned them by name in your book.
Yeah.
Why were they not willing to do what you said yes to?
I think, and I do have a sort of, I do understand why they said no. Because they were very much involved in the hierarchies of Afrikanerdom. So their position, if there was a leak, that would have jeopardized their position. My own position was never part of a hierarchy. And I think that was to my, not to my credit, but it was that puts me in a different sort of position. Made it easier for me to interact with a number of other actors outside Afrikanerdom and even with the ANC. But it was still risky because the ANC was not just regarded as the enemy, it was regarded as a terrorist organization. And how to get past that sort of concept of the enemy or the terrorist, then it was not very easy, and that's why these other people I also talked to had to say no.
My memory is that Thabo Mbeki at the time was seen as the leader of the ANC in exile. You got on a plane, you had to go meet him in London to convince him of being willing to enter into this process. How did that meeting go?
Well, I met him the first time in 1988. In 1987, Aziz Bahat was the leader of the ANC group. And I met him in 1988. And there was, at that first meeting, it was quite clear he wanted a negotiated deal. And I must explain this because in 1985, at one of the conferences of the ANC, negotiations as a pillar of the struggle was accepted, and he was the father of this idea, the architect of this pillar. Of course, there was also the fighters within the ANC, so you also had to steer very carefully in the ANC into a direction with the help of Oliver Tambo, that in the end we'll sit around the table and we need to start talking about that. So he was very much in favor of a negotiated deal. You can ask questions what sort of deal he wanted at that stage, but that is a different question. And I think the critical meeting was on the 31st of May 1989. And it was the day of the Republic in South Africa, and I opted for that date
South Africa.
quite deliberately.
South Africa's National Day.
That is South Africa's National Day. So we met in London, cut a long story short, in a pub, and the reason was that the National Intelligence people told me, listen, you have to be careful that there is not someone listening in to the discussion, so do it in a pub. It's noisy, and then you can convey the messages. And the request I had was twofold. One, to get a personal telephone number from him where he could be found by National Intelligence Agency. And the guy who was very much involved, his name is Maritz Spaarwater. He was from National Intelligence. He's just written a book to tell his own story. And the second thing that I had to get confirmation from him is whether he would be prepared to interact directly with National Intelligence Agents, and he agreed.
Willie, why would... Go ahead.
And I think that was a critical moment for him also, because that decision he made could have also exploded in his face. Because he couldn't consult with the rest of the ANC, of course, he consulted with them, but there were other people also, Chris Hani, etc., Mac Maharaj. They wanted to go on fighting.
So why were you willing to do this and take the risks that came in terms of your life and career and how people saw you, and why was he willing to trust you?
Why I decided was not the moral reason. I didn't got involved because I had all sorts of moral ideals. I prefer to say, and it's true, it was a strategic decision. It was the only option as far as I was concerned for me. I had no other option. And I discussed it with my wife also, Anna Marie, and we came to this conclusion. It's the only option. And that's why I focus so much on the context of the 80s. The options became limited. And the avenues towards peace and peacemaking were becoming smaller and even less. So that was my main reason. And at that stage, I accepted that if it misfired, then I'll have to leave the university, etc., etc. So it was a risk, but it was a calculated risk. On the other issue, I think, Jannie, is one of the things that I became very much not just interested in, but more than that, it became a passion, is how to build trust and confidence in a situation where two people look at each other as enemies or as terrorists. And it's a very personal sort of issue. And we discovered, I think, that we can trust each other for the following reasons. First of all, the first thing I did was to inform him that I have connections in Pretoria. And I was informed by my friends in Pretoria to wait with this, and I decided, no, I can't wait, it's my decision. And I remember him telling me, you're taking a risk. So I told him, I said, yes, but it's a much bigger risk not to tell you than telling you. So you
were telling him you had to report to NIS, to National Intelligence Bureau.
You see, in this sort of, in my experience, if you share risks and rewards, it's a way to build bridges and to create trust and confidence. Because for him, it was also a risk. I remember that Chris Hani was not informed. When he heard about it, he exploded at a meeting in Lusaka. And so the sharing of risk and reward is a very important brick, building block in trust and confidence building. And I think the second thing is so sort of obvious, but in a certain sense so also trivial. You don't just talk about politics. You start talking about things you share, your interests, the music you love, the books you read. It's got nothing to do with the crisis back down here in South Africa.
The human aspect.
But it has to do with the human aspect. And this is the one element I would like to identify, that if human relationships and trust and confidence is built upon sharing views and talking about family and talking about music and books.
Now, Willie, there were other things that happened before this. There was the Dakar in... let's talk about that a little bit. Let's talk about IDASA. There were other, let's call it third-party attempts. There were also attempts from overseas to intervene in South Africa. You referred to Javier van der Merwe's attempt the famous conflict resolution person here in South Africa, why that failed. Give me a little background on all those events that occurred before that, but also on the fact that South Africans were intent on not having their conflict negotiated or mediated from the outside.
Yeah. Now, maybe I should just, as an introductory remark, say that I became fascinated with the process, not with events as such, but with processes of peacemaking. And I've read quite a lot about it, and it's how I get not in touch, but I read the books of MacDonald, who was an ex-American ambassador, about different tracks, 2 tracks or multi-track. There is the formal one, mandate, official, and so on. And then the second or other tracks, not formal, no mandate. In my case, I prefer to do it in a confidential manner, because that's the way how you build trust and confidence in deeply divided societies and so on.
Now, I'm interested in this, but your interest in track 2 diplomacy, did that occur? Did you find that concept during this time, or only afterwards realize, oh, this is what we did?
It is learning by doing.
Okay.
At one stage, I sat back, and I do have an interest in philosophy, and so not much maybe and so on, but I do have. And so I sort of sat back and started to reflect on what are we doing, and are we making progress? We had an item at every single meeting there in Britain, and the title of that item was The Way Ahead. And I always said that, you know, once we want to talk about the way ahead, we need to just reflect on where we're coming from, not just in the country, but in this process of dialogue. And that's how I started to read about all sorts of fascinating literature, and went to, in fact, and read about also the negotiations in Vienna on nuclear disarmament. And in the end got hold of that wonderful play, A Walk in the Woods, by Lee Blessing, an American. And in that story, I went to see that play, in fact, in 1989 in London. And it's illuminating, and for me a significant play, because the play also focuses on the role that can be played by individuals and individual relationships in opening up processes that can lead to negotiated deals, as in the case in Vienna. So that is sort of my experience of learning by doing. And nou het ek nog net my praat.
I love that expression. I lost my wire, but I'll go back to where you wanted to be, or I'll take you back.
Ja, wag, dat sê net vir my.
So you were giving me background on sort of the theory of track 2 diplomacy, MacDonald, Bendamani, the book you read early on. But we were also talking about the fact that South Africans, there were the earlier interventions, bringing Afrikaners together in Dakar. Yours was not the only attempt at a third-party process.
Absolutely. It was a multi-track. IDASA, and particularly the meeting in Dakar.
Remind us who IDASA was.
IDASA was the Institute for Democratic South Africa. That was started in the middle of the 80s by Van Zyl Slabbert and Alex Bourrain. And the two of them left Parliament, and they started this NGO, got funding, and it was a movement from civil society. Very mixed. It's not just Afrikaners, also English speakers and so on, and it went public, and they did a number of things. And I think that the Dakar conference was in this context very important, because it made public the concerns of many South Africans, white and black, about
Okay.
the future in South Africa.
So Dakar brought Afrikaners and ANC members
Oh, yes,
together.
it was a form of
Yeah.
conscientization, but it was not mediation. And I got involved in a process that I would like to call mediation, or
Facilitation.
or facilitation, which was something different. There's a number of other things also. Javier van der Merwe played an important role. Unfortunately, the meeting he tried to facilitate between me and another South African academic, Sampieter Blanche, and people in Lusaka didn't materialize because the then President P.W. Botha called us in and said, listen, we don't talk to murderers. And he requested us in a frankly but very firm manner not to accept the invitation. And then we decided that for strategic purposes we can't accept the invitation. I believe it would have, for me, it was better to got involved in 1987 than 1985 or 1984. So there were many processes, smaller ones also, because it takes a lot of drops of rain to cause a river.
But you say in your book that Dakar, Alex Boraine, Van Zyl Slabbert, we respected South Africans, and among people who wanted change and wanted to end apartheid. But you say that sadly Dakar, to a degree, tanked, destroyed their ability to play a third-party role. How so?
And as a mediator and even negotiator.
How so?
And the twofold reason. The one, and I think it's a very critical reason, the negotiations on Namibia was coming to an end, came to an end with an election in Namibia.
Okay, now Southwest Africa, Namibia was still a protectorate of South
And it was
protectorate of South Africa,
a protectorate.
and that process was coming to an end.
Yeah, but the Resolution 435, it's really engineered that whole process where Chester Crocker from the United States played such an important role. And I had the opportunity also to meet with Crocker on several occasions, and I have a very high appreciation of him and his skills.
You had an eight-year mediation of that process.
Yeah, but Resolution 435 was negotiated with the involvement of outsiders. The Americans, of course, and even the Russians had to play a particular role because the Cubans were in Angola. And it's very interesting that at the very first meeting between national intelligence people and the ANC in the Palace Hotel in Lucerne, it was agreed, no outsiders. No outsiders. Mr. Mandela had the same view during the prison talks, and they didn't want the Resolution 435 for South Africa. They said, we must. And there's, of course, another equally important reason. There were two power blocks, ANC, Exile and Inside, and the National Party and its military establishment too. And I've been asked the question some time ago, but what about the Pan-Africanist Conference, and what about the smaller parties? But the power struggle in South Africa was really between these two big groups. So it's about power. And how do you deal with that relationship of power and the conflict between the two in a mediating and negotiating manner? Now, maybe I need to mention a third, because it is connected with the second reason. The ANC wanted to talk to Afrikaners
Directly.
in the establishment, or close to the establishment, not to liberals outside.
Therefore, Francis Slabbert was not seen as...
Was not seen. He was regarded, very highly regarded, and regarded as a extremely important person, but not as
a part of the establishment.
Yeah.
Yeah. You also mentioned something else in your book that was seen by the ANC as a piece of history that they didn't like, and that kept them away from being accepting of a third-party involvement from outside South Africa, and that was the Lancaster Agreement.
Yeah.
In terms of Rhodesia.
Absolutely.
And what came after that.
Absolutely, very important. I forgot about that one. I think that was also an emotional reason, because the ANC was very closely aligned with Zimbabwe and the strongman in Zimbabwe, Mugabe. And because he was the front of the frontline states, and so that was a very, very, very. It became a very emotional reason, not just a political or strategic reason.
Frontline states against South Africa, in terms of against the white government in South Africa.
Yeah.
Now, let me just then take you back to London, and say that there was a third party there. Congold, was that their name?
Yeah.
So there was somebody who played sort of a, maybe not mediating, but facilitating role in that meeting.
Congold also provided some of the funding, or most of the funding, and then what it also did was to provide us with facilities. And what one of the things, that I've learned in this whole process, that the environment plays a role, not just the social environment. And we had this wonderful, some instances, estate at Mel's Park, where we could walk among the woods, and we could talk, and it created an environment,
a physical environment,
which was conducive.
But that's not what you're talking about now.
Yeah. But then secondly, the Congold had a public relations officer, information, with Michael Young, and he chaired the formal meetings, which was also a good thing, because you need a neutral person, neutral in the sense it's not South African, but who had a good understanding of what was going on in South Africa and also within the ANC. And he had a very good understanding, and I think one of the reasons why our discussions went so well in the formal formal discussions was because of his chairmanship, Michael Young. But we also had the practice that on some occasions he had to leave the room, and we then started to socialize only as South Africans, but then talk about very critical issues, for instance about the sport boycott. We did that in his absence.
You asked him to leave the room?
Yeah.
Yes.
And that was an agreement. So the process itself and the structure within which the dialogue or the discussions took place also was well planned, and I think it was one of the reasons for the success.
So it is a very loose facilitating role, but an important one.
Very loose, yeah. But he was a good facilitator, and what I've experienced, without a good facilitator, who's got a good understanding of not just the political, but also the emotional and other sort of issues. It's good to have a good facilitator. Maybe it's something else I need. because of the environment where we could socialize, one of the things that I've experienced in these sort of talks was that informal socializing is of the uppermost importance.
The things that happened away from the table.
The things that happen away from the table.
They were?
When, for instance, yeah, there was a cricket tour in South Africa. It was a rebel tour and funded by corporates in South Africa.
Explain the rebel part.
The rebel part was because there was sanctions. South Africans couldn't play international cricket. They were kicked out of every sort of international game. And then this Mike Gatting, who was a well-known British cricket player, he was paid to put together a team. It was called the Gatting Rebel Tour.
So the rebel tour was going on and you watched it all?
And we watched it. And then we sat one day and it was in fact on this sort of happy coincidences also play an important role in this sort of process. On the 2 days before Mr. Mandela's release, on the Friday night, we socialized and we had good South African wine, although the ANC was in favor of sanctions and South African wine, stuff like that.
And at some point somebody brought South African fruit.
We even gave them fruit. So, and then we started to talk. I said, listen, but you know, can't we stop this Gatting tour? It was creating havoc here in South Africa with protestations and things. And this is why it's also good to have a businessman present. And Marinus Darling, who was the chief executive officer of one of the biggest insurance companies in South Africa, Sanlam. And I remember him, what he said, you know, we were talking, he said, listen, let's stop arguing and talking. How do we stop this tour? We need to talk. And we need to come up with a solution because it can't go on like this. And so, you know, he was a problem solver. And in these sort of discussions, you need someone with a strong personality who can push people and say, listen, let's solve the problem. Don't just discuss the problem. What do you suggest? And we came up with a suggestion, you know, that there were 2 legs to this tour. That the second leg would be cancelled, the first leg shortened. South African company will pay the expenses if necessary. It was not necessary, but that was done within the informal socializing facet of the process.
But what I'm sorry, was
and it had quite an impact because as his part phoned Sam Ramsamy, who was then the chief architect of the sports boycott. He was in London and told him, listen, this is what is going to happen. And then the South African side phoned someone else in South Africa and said, listen, we have no mandate, but this is what needs to happen. And fortunately, the next day, the clerk announced that he's going to release Mandela on the Sunday.
Wow.
And then that Sunday, when Mandela was released, on that Sunday, the sport boycott was also, or the Gatting tour, was also off the agenda.
So you were discussing 2 things I heard was the ability to problem solve around smaller things in order to problem solve around bigger things.
That's it.
But also that South Africans found their, for lack of a better term, humanity and South Africanness together away from the table.
I'm very glad you mentioned that point. And Aziz, the first meeting, which Aziz was the leader from the ANC, 3 South Africans, they were all South Africans, but 3 from here, from Stellenbosch University and 3 or 4 from the NC side. But I remember, and I've never met Aziz, and we were all very sensitive and even worried and so. And Aziz came up to me and he greeted me in Afrikaans, and which was a very good strategic ploy. Aziz, I told him so at a later stage. But there was something else also, and he asked me a question. He said, also in Afrikaans, he asked me, how is the weather in our country? And I suddenly realized we're enemies, between quotation marks, but at least we share and love the weather.
In our country.
In our country, not Britain, our country. And I think this idea of that we're South Africans and that we need to resolve the crisis here in South Africa by South Africans was also built on the experience. And in fact, Aziz at that meeting, the discussion we had about the cricket, he was adamant that the first international cricket game between of South Africans should be played in India. And India was the most fiercest anti-apartheid, and the first game was played in India, and I think we won it, South Africans, but the new team.
Willie, you've referred to track 2 diplomacy, but how would you describe, generally speaking, what this whole process was for you? Talks about talks, dialogue, how would you frame it?
Well, first of all, I'll say it was one of the best learning experiences I've ever had in my life. Because, not because it was not mandated, that was not the issue, but I had to talk to real people coming from elsewhere, the enemy. So I became obsessed with how to deconstruct the concept of the enemy, to engage even with a Marxist in a manner that will bring out my humanity and his humanity without me thinking that this is a Marxist and a communist. It was a personal sort of thing, but it was a learning experience.
And you had to think of you as not a racist, etc.
And exactly, and I mean, their view of me was someone coming from Stellenbosch,
the heart of Afrikanerdom.
The heart of Afrikanerdom. We had something like 6 prime ministers in the old regime coming from Stellenbosch. So this was a lot of perceptions and ideas about the Afrikaner side. And you had to sort of delve through the perceptions and constructions and develop new images and new perceptions, and also try to identify the sort of values that we both sides adhere to. That was a very important element. The second one I would like, the description I would like to use is that I've become committed and convinced to the necessity of informal, confidential talks within deeply divided societies.
Background negotiations.
Backroom negotiations. I don't want to use the word negotiations, but mediation or maybe just interaction. And I've read about Northern Ireland, and it's very interesting how the divisions in Ireland was different, or are different than in South Africa.
But what you're saying, if I understand you correctly, is there's a very strong need for creating an atmosphere or contact or understanding in order to finally have negotiation or mediation.
Absolutely. I would say it's a prerequisite.
In divided societies.
In divided society. And there's a reason. You see, and the reason is not just the divisions, and it's not just the perceptions and the animosity and the construct of the enemy. There's something else missing in deeply divided societies, and it's social capital. And you know, without social capital, without networks, functioning networks within a society, it's very difficult really to develop a democracy. And my own view, and during these talks, I became more and more convinced that if we want to deepen and broaden our new democracy in this country, we'll have to put a lot of energy and effort in creating viable and well-functioning social capital, networks, cross-cultural, cross-racial networks.
There's still a need for relationship building.
Absolutely, but absolutely. You know, during these talks, I suddenly realized that one of the most destructive things that happened in South Africa was the Group Areas Act. Because the Group Areas Act was not just a demographic division. It was a cultural division, it was a religious division, it was divisive all over the spectrum.
Willie, just quickly, you're referring to the Group Areas Act, one of the 5 pillars of apartheid, mixed marriages, immorality. Some of those were already taken away by then.
Yeah, by then, yeah. And of course the Population Registration Act, because the Population Registration Act was even more divisive in the sense that you had the separateness. And let me try to explain it in a practical manner. You know, when I came back after the second or third meeting in London with the ANC, came back to Stellenbosch, I suddenly realized this is not a town, an integrated town. It's a town with a white part and with all these other parts.
It's really separate towns together.
No, the possibility of social capital. I'm talking about bridging social capital, not bonding social capital, as in a family.
Yeah, if I may, we had the International Association of Conflict Management here in Stellenbosch, their first African conference this week, and Vasu Gounden from Accord said that when he got invited to Javier van der Merwe, the pioneer of conflict resolution's home, it was his first visit to a home of a white man. During that time, no South Africans really socialized with anybody of a different race.
Yeah.
This is what you're talking
Absolutely,
about.
that's what I'm talking about.
Yes.
And I'm afraid to say, you know, that this issue of social capital is still a problem that we experience to really build well-functioning social capital. Nowadays also called social cohesion. There was a conference also organized by the Department of Arts and Culture in Kliptown, where the Freedom Charter many years ago was formulated, and I was there at this conference a couple of weeks ago. Is that there's no way that we will really deepen and broaden our fledgling democracy without an effort, an energetic effort to create networks across cultural and racial lines, or to build social capital. And if you ask me where we have failed as far as the negotiated settlement is concerned, or the transition, and transition is a process, it's not just an event, so it takes time. I'll say we've neglected, even in fact in some instances also destroyed social capital. The relationships between the different groups are not what they should be.
Okay. I'd like to return to that, but could I return, and I really do want to return to that towards the end of our interview, but can I take you back to London and the negotiations and say that you refer in your book to the need for what you term insider negotiations, which you had with Thabo Mbeki. What did you mean by that, and what was that?
That was, and I have to say this with a smile, because someone asked me the question whether, I informed my colleagues from South Africa on every issue and so on. And I had to say no.
Your colleagues being national intelligence.
Yeah, so I couldn't. And I couldn't inform the Afrikaners about my connections with Pretoria. So what I did was to get Thabo Mbeki outside the building, and we went for walks, a couple of walks among the woods. That's where the whole symbolism of a walk in the woods
Your relationship.
really sort of makes me so not just smiling, but it's there among the woods and among, under a tree and so on. I did it even with Willem de Klerk at one stage, because he was the brother of FW, who just became president.
And it was part of your negotiations.
And it was part.
Let's return to that one, but tell me about insider negotiations.
And but the insider was the one-on-one, which I couldn't share with the others coming from South Africa, and particularly the insider negotiations or talks was focused on questions that I asked him, which national intelligence passed on to me, and so that was the more personalized and exclusive interaction.
Things that you didn't feel comfortable addressing at the table.
Yeah, I couldn't, for instance, inform the other participants that I'm on my way to London to meet with Mbeki one-on-one, to get the telephone number from him. I didn't even inform that I've done it.
Okay. What I really was asking is, when you were in London for that process and you went for a walk with Mbeki, were those topics that you could discuss at the table with your other ANC and Afrikaner members or not, or was that the reason for the walk in the woods, so to speak?
It was the reason for the walk in the woods. I think one has to make choices, and some of these choices are not just delicate, are extremely difficult. When you, as a person participating in the process, must decide what are you going to share with the rest of the participants and what not. It's not just a moral decision, it's a strategic decision and all sorts of reasons. And you have to make those decisions, you have to make them in order to keep the process going and also to prevent leaks. And because we had a leak, and it was published in the South African Sunday Times and also in the newspapers in Britain, and it nearly jeopardized or sabotaged the process.
I was going to ask you about media and protecting your process.
Yeah.
Now, so what was the gain or what was the effect of those insider dialogues, and were they fed back to the group? Explain that, the process.
Some were fed back and some not.
Okay.
I think in the case of Mbeki, he informed Tambo. He had a very close relationship with Tambo. And then I, of course, informed the people from national intelligence. The technical term that I started to use, which was also picked up in the literature, is the transfer of messages and the transfer of information from an informal to a formal agent. National intelligence was a formal agent. Tambo was the president of the ANC. And that transfer of the conveying of the message is then
very important.
Very important.
But it's also...
If I just may add to it, and there is a risk, of course, not just the risk that there could be a leak, but you have to convey the message in such a manner that you don't
Destroy the process.
And that you don't interpret the message in such a manner that it suits you as the messenger. That's why I like the Greek term, the god Hermes, was also a go-between. And in the literature we talk, and particularly in theology, we talk about hermeneutics.
So
and hermeneutics is the deliberate attempt to convey the message and interpret it in such a manner that it's not misleading.
So if you take on this role of second track diplomacy and a participation in this back channel, so to speak, there's a certain morality needed, and you can't politicize that process.
That's where the morality comes in. And I mean, you must discipline yourself not to convey your personal views in order to influence the other party. That's where the morality comes in.
It's therefore also crucial who gets invited to those things.
Very crucial.
Now, one of the people that was invited on the Afrikaner side was Willem Wimpie de Klerk, brother of the later president, and Sunday newspaper editor. The closeness that he had to de Klerk, a plus, a minus, what was the role that he played, positively or negatively?
De Klerk, Wimpie de Klerk, was a well-known progressive and enlightened figure within Afrikanerdom.
And not a member of the National Party.
And not,
Democratic Party, correct?
But there was something else. He was a senior member, not just of the Broederbond as such, but he was on the executive. I was out of the Broederbond at that stage. And then the chairperson of the Broederbond was Pieter de Lange, who also met at one stage with Mbeki in New York.
But he's a perfect example of how he really had two very strong avenues to track one.
That is absolutely the case.
Okay.
And he informed the Broederbond, and he wrote letters to his brother. Now his brother said in public that he never read the letters.
De Klerk was president by then.
You can't expect de Klerk to make a public statement and said he was informed by his brother. And so you must accept that. But I think for the ANC, when de Klerk became, FW became president, for the ANC to have Willem, his brother, also present, was also a way of creating confidence and trust.
Because they thought that they now had a channel, a direct
channel. Whether he was the channel or not doesn't matter. There was an attempt by the national intelligence people on the instructions of de Klerk, the president, to get Willem out of the process. And in fact, he was requested to
step down,
not to participate. And I had a long talk with him and then said to him, it's your choice. And then he opted for participation.
Okay. So again, Willie, I'm returning to an earlier question. Dialogue, talks about talks, how do you frame it?
I was inspired by someone, by an editor of a well-known black newspaper in Soweto, which is called the Sowetan, still in existence.
Agri Cluster.
Agri Cluster. And we were very despondent. It was way back in 1985 and 1986, and we were very despondent about the future. And it became a phrase in my, not just my mind or my heart, but in my conscience. It's never too late to talk. So I will describe what we did as talks about talks. It was talks about talks, but it was not meaningless talks, because there were avenues from these talks about talks to stimulate other talks. and to bridge, to build a bridge towards more formal agents and formal participants of talks.
But you must have had a dialogue in which the ANC said, "You're racists," and you said, "Yes, but you're blowing up people." You know, examples of issues on both sides in which you had to come to some kind of understanding through a dialogue process.
I know it was not a Sunday school picnic.
Yeah.
These sort of things are not, it's not sentimental. And you never enter it for emotional or sentimental reasons. You have to bluntly state your positions. It's the only way.
So there were
I've always said we need to put the hard truths
on the table.
on the table, and we did.
Were there
We did.
were there moments of heated debate? Did anyone ever storm out? Was anybody too hurt to hear the message the other side was given?
No one stormed out, but we had some very, very heavy debate on the issue of violence, particularly. And then when business people got involved, sanctions. And on the side of Mbeki and Aziz and the others, of course, they put on the table, but the state is actually the main agent of violence. And that the cause of the violence is not the ANC in Lusaka, but Pretoria and General Magnus Malan of the military. And so yes, no, hard truths.
So, very shortly after that, President F.W. de Klerk released Nelson Mandela.
Yeah.
So, what was that came out of your process that led him to have the confidence to do that, that started then the negotiations for a new South Africa?
I think one must accept that the reason for the negotiated settlement, one can't describe it just to the talks we had and others had. The world changed. The world changed dramatically with the breakup of the Soviet Union, the fact that Namibia became independent, so it was a whole basket of reasons.
Which happened the year before.
And then, and in the case of de Klerk, and I always say, and this is a personal view, that the most important decision he took was on the 17th of September 1989. Not the speech he made when he released Mandela.
Which was in January of 1990.
February. The reason why I say this is that de Klerk only was inaugurated as president on the 20th of September 1989. On the 17th of September 1989, the two agents of national intelligence, Louw and Spaarwater, who met with Thabo and Zuma in Zurich, in Lucerne, came to report to him about their meeting a couple of days prior to that, on the 12th of September, the same day that Anton Lubowski, who was an advocate, was murdered
in Southwest Africa.
Namibia. Yeah. And de Klerk, this is how the agents told me the story, so I'm not sucking it out from my thumb, was very irritated and even upset about what they've done, the talks, and he asked them where their mandate comes from. Okay. So they provided him with a mandate. And then, instead of being angry, chasing them away with their report, he said, okay, let's sit down and talk. I'm going to take the ball. It's a decisive decision. So when he was inaugurated in the church in Pretoria 3 days later, he knew that.
But you are raising something which we haven't discussed, which I've heard about many times, and can't remember whether you write about it in your book, which is that to a degree, ironically, national intelligence was ahead of the political movement in South Africa.
Yeah.
It kind of led the change towards South Africa, which you then became a practical part of. And as I understand it, President Clark was kind of angry when he found that out, because he realized they're the head of the game. And what you're now describing is he then said, this cannot work, and then he grabbed the ball himself and he led.
Yeah.
That's what you were saying.
Oh yes, I make no bones about it, no secret of it, that national intelligence played a decisive role. It is in any democracy, you know, a good intelligence service, and I think South Africa's intelligence service is one of the top 4 or 5 in the world, have to provide the leadership with strategic inputs, political inputs. So yes,
Yeah.
but I need to say, and I need to emphasize this also, it's not just that the world has changed, but there was an international consensus about the way forward. An international consensus in the West, in Moscow, everywhere. And what the clerk did, I think, was to accept there is a international consensus.
About?
There was no way
Consensus.
about the negotiated settlement,
Okay.
and even the preconditions, because one of the preconditions was the release of Mandela. It was not something that he thought out. He responded to an international consensus, and in a manner which really made the clerk the sort of leader we needed at that stage. He could have said no, maybe. I don't think so, because it would have been a lost case in his case. And the clerk is a legal person, and I don't think any good legal person takes on a case that you know
You can't
you
win.
don't have the faintest chance
Yeah.
to win.
So, what made national intelligence such a change agent? The theory as I had it, and I want you to expand on that, was that there was the young Bloemfontein academic that at a very young age, help me with his name,
Neil Barnard.
Neil Barnard, he was barely in his 30s, barely 40, when he became the head of national intelligence. And that they made an assessment that essentially said that to keep apartheid would cost so much money and so many lives, and that it's simply not doable. Is that the theory? Was that their analysis?
That's how I interpret it. You see, one must also remember that there were also the prison talks, which was started, ironically, by Winnie Mandela, then the wife of the imprisoned Nelson Mandela, walking up on a flight to Kobie Coetzee, was the Minister of Justice and also in charge of intelligence. So there was that process also in those talks.
Robben Island prison talks.
Yeah.
Say a little bit more about them.
And we call it the prison talks. And Mandela was taken to hospital, and then Kobie Coetzee Hospital in Cape Town, and then the minister, she met with him, went up to him, and met with him and told him, said, listen, you need to go and talk to my husband because he's in hospital. She was on her way to visit him in hospital. And then he did that, just that. No one has ever explained to me why he took that decision, talking about Minister Kobie Coetzee. But it was an important decision, because then P.W. Botha was still the president. Coetzee never informed the cabinet of these so-called prison talks. Then Mandela stayed on in Polsmoor. And so the talks...
Polsmoor jail.
Pollsmoor prison. And then what then happened in 1988 is that a committee was formed by Coetzee, the minister, with people from intelligence to structure and organize these talks. Cabinet was not involved. Not involved. So one must look at the process from different perspectives, but the role played by Coetzee and eventually also intelligence was crucial. It could be that they thought, well, maybe Mandela will compromise himself, but he is not the person to compromise. I mean, he had only one idea, and that was the liberation of South Africa, and the ANC unbanned. And so all those preconditions came on the table before de Klerk made his decision.
But what you're pointing out too is that there were various processes going on.
Various
at the same
processes. That's the point I want to make. And I think that the reason I don't regard the South Africa's negotiated settlement as a miracle which happened out of the blue. It was different processes coming together under the leadership of a person like de Klerk.
Okay. In your book, you sort of defame a statement that's often made about South Africa, which was, or made about conflict in general, which that in order for conflicts to end, there need to be a herding stalemate. You didn't agree?
No, it's only partially true. Because as I've said, the world has changed. There was a international consensus, and I give all the credit for that international consensus to Oliver Tambo and Thabo Mbeki. I mean, it was a diplomatic coup. And if I may say so, I think Tambo and Mbeki prevented the civil war from really escalating. Of course, there was a herding stalemate in the sense of that, you know, it was terrible what was happening in South Africa, but some other forces also played a role. And I put maybe too much emphasis on the role played by this international consensus. And Thatcher also getting angry with the stubbornness of P.W. Botha.
So there were many forces working at the
Many
same
forces, and I would like to single out what the pressure put on us, of the South African government, by the Americans, by the British, the Germans, but in the end also the pressure put on the ANC by Gorbachev. I mentioned it also in my book. They said the killings must stop. You must start talking.
You conclude your book with a very interesting statement, and that is your the process that you were part of. You refer to it as a love affair with trust and confidence building.
Yeah, I use the metaphor of a love affair quite deliberately, because there is something like personal relationships. If you take personal relationships and humanness out of these sort of processes, and I don't think it's viable, because in the end you need also to rely on the personal relationship and discovering your humanness, and that you're part of the human race, and in that way proceed. I'm not saying it's the only element, but I'm saying it's an extremely important starting point.
On a lighter moment, before I ask a more serious question for my final one, Endgame the movie, in which William Hurt played Willie Estreise. I never saw you in little bow ties.
I've never in my life even had a bow tie, and I think the other is my wife. It's not this sort of timid, passive woman that was pictured or portrayed in the film, and my daughter, which was also portrayed as this sort of very obedient and person. No, that was a mistake.
Okay,
One.
you refer to the movie as Faction. Tell me about your thoughts about the movie.
Yeah, no, it's faction. It's it's partially true, but then also a big part of it is just fiction. And but the movie, interesting thing is, and we as a family, with some of our friends and the Mbekis with their friends and so on, we had a preview
together.
In the end, and we had a discussion also.
Interesting.
And then we came to the conclusion that the movie helped us to understand what we tried to do. So in that sense, you know, and I feel very strongly about plays and movies that can help you to understand complex problems. So yes, faction, and it's not true that I became his trusted advisor, as was said in the movie. I said to a group of black students from Africa that actually he became my trusted advisor, just to sort of put another tag also on the whole issue. And then the movie was fascinating in the black community. The movie was very much the flavor of the month.
Really?
And I think, Jannie, there is a reason. Because Africa has got a lot of conflicts, not just racial, but also ethnic. And there's a lot of conflict about resources. And I think greed plays an important role in some of these conflicts. And most of these students sitting there, there's quite a big number of them, also from Africa and South Africa. And they suddenly, and the movie gives out the message, it is possible to come to a negotiated peace. I even want to go further, and this is a very, very personal and maybe subjective interpretation. For them to experience that a man like Thabo Mbeki, which I regard as one of the top leaders on the African continent, and a white person, pale skin, from Stellenbosch, given my background, would start talking and come to certain agreements and even to develop a certain personal relationship, makes it more possible for them also to do their thing. So symbolically, the movie, I think, played an important role.
Willie, wonderful conversation. Thank you very much. My final question. I spent the last week here in Stellenbosch at the IACM conference, as I said, International Association for Conflict Management, and there were various sessions on South Africa. And I came away with two conclusions, which is, yes, there's a new South Africa, there's a new constitution, many agreements, there's a functioning South Africa, but the transformation seemingly is incomplete. And the incompleteness of it from these presentations and speaking to people lies in still a need for, in post-apartheid South Africa, between Afrikaners, a need for making peace around certain things. There's still a lot of bad feelings about certain things. But also between black and white, we have agreements, but we don't truly have relationship transformations. Fair?
I agree with you wholeheartedly. And it's, to me, it's very worrisome that on the level of relationships, we're still in a new kind of group areas. And
separation.
And the way forward is going to be very tricky and very difficult, and because a number of whites are angry, but I've also met a number of young blacks who are equally angry and say, but what have we gained and have we succeeded? And as I've mentioned earlier on, our social capital, extremely weak. Extremely weak.
There's also a fear of a South Africa that's economically not taking care of an underclass of people.
Yeah. It's an important point.
Economic underclass, I mean.
Absolutely. Because there's no way that you can create social capital by just being friendly towards each other. Social capital in a country like South Africa has very much a lot to do with bread and butter issues. The bread on the table. I've experienced it the other day in Kliptown. I suddenly realized that all the wonderful theories we have, the policies, etc., will end up in the dustbin as far as social capital is concerned if we don't do something extraordinary to get food on the table and jobs for people.
So the story of South Africa is far from over.
Far from over.
Billy, thank you very much. It's been an honor.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I appreciate it.